Ghanaians George Murdoch, a veteran with a dark past, and engineer Timothy West, shattered by his wife's betrayal, face trials that turn their lives upside down. The story of revenge, betrayal, and second chances reveals how the pain of loss can be the beginning of a path to redemption or retribution. Gunny George Murdoch, a seasoned ranger with 2 decades of service, bore numerous scars as evidence of his experiences. Among his many injuries was a distinctive scar extending from his left eye to his mouth, a reminder of an explosion 2 years prior. He sat cradling his driver's head, watching as his teammates' condition deteriorated. Their Humvee lay overturned and damaged about 15 feet away. The patrol, consisting of 3 vehicles, had been nearing a village when the lead vehicle struck an explosive device, flipping over and causing multiple casualties. Murdoch's vehicle, the last in the formation, was hit by an attack that forced it off the road. Meanwhile, the central vehicle came under fire from a nearby building. George quickly pulled his injured driver, Simon Wilcox, from the vehicle to safety. Another member of the team managed to escape from the rear and brought essential supplies, including rifles and extra magazines. Upon inspecting Wilcox, George noticed a severe injury and quickly applied first aid. Despite his efforts, Wilcox passed away before a rescue team arrived. Reinforcements soon reached the scene, neutralizing the attackers and securing the area. After the incident, the team returned to base for debriefing. There, George was informed that their unit would return home early due to high casualties. This news was bittersweet for the team, as their tour had been scheduled to end a month later. The unit boarded a transport plane and arrived back in the United States in the early hours of the morning. Gunny quietly walked across the base to his assigned quarters. Jill, his wife of 12 years, was not expecting him home for another month. When George arrived, he discovered an uncomfortable truth. Jill had been unfaithful during his absence. Overwhelmed by emotion, George confronted her and the individual involved. A tense and emotional exchange followed, with Jill attempting to explain her actions and George expressing his deep hurt and frustration. In the end, George decided to leave the house temporarily to collect his thoughts. The situation left him grappling with a mix of emotions, from betrayal to the challenges of balancing duty and personal relationships. As she spoke, the image of Wilcox dying in his arms flashed through his mind. He lifted Host into a sitting position, snapped his neck, and let him fall to the ground. Witnessing this, Jill began to scream, prompting Gunny to pull her close and suffocate her as she struggled against his grip. After she quieted down, he looked at the 2 lifeless bodies without feeling anything. He took a shower, dressed in his combat fatigues, packed a couple of backpacks, and threw them into his truck in the garage. He then filled a bag with as much dry food as he could find, added a few gallons of water, and placed it in the truck as well. Next, he gathered his service weapon and a suppressed .22 rifle along with all available ammunition. Leaving the bodies where they were, he went into the spare bedroom to get some sleep for the night. In the morning, Gunny double-checked that he had everything and set out. When he reached the gate, the security post simply waved him through. Without a concrete plan, he knew he needed to get as far away as possible before the bodies were discovered. He estimated he had about 5 hours at most, so he got on the freeway and drove for 3 hours before taking an exit. He continued driving for another half hour to the nearest town, stopped at a service station, and changed into civilian clothes while keeping his combat fatigues for later. His next stop was a used car dealership, where he traded his 2-year-old truck for an old Ford pickup and $16,000. He drove until he could no longer stay awake, then pulled into a campsite and slept in the cab. Continuing deeper into the forest, he searched for a suitable spot to abandon the truck where it wouldn't be easily found. He turned onto an old logging trail and followed it to the end, pushing the truck as far into the surrounding forest as possible before covering it with vegetation. From that point on, he would travel on foot only. Just before dark, he set up a cold camp and settled in for the night. Back at the base, it was noticed that Gunny hadn't shown up for his morning briefing. Since he hadn't returned until the early hours, his commanding officer let it go. However, when his CO hadn't heard from him by the afternoon, he sent his sergeant to Gunny's house to check on him. Upon arrival, the sergeant found the door open and entered, calling out for Gunny. Finding the house silent, he searched downstairs and then upstairs, where he discovered the bodies. Understanding what had transpired, he felt no sympathy for the two unfaithful individuals, but knew he had to report the discovery. An hour later, a manhunt was initiated. Gunny was accustomed to discomfort, so he comfortably lay on his makeshift bed of ferns and quickly fell asleep. In his dreams, he saw Wilcox dying in his arms and returning home to a woman who believed he was merely pretending to be a soldier. He woke up cursing and lay there thinking about all the servicemen risking their lives for unfaithful women who couldn't remain loyal. As he lay there, the darkness within his soul took control, and he resolved to make as many cheating wives pay for their disrespect as possible. In his mind, he began to formulate a plan. In the ensuing months, he carried out a peculiar routine. His process began with setting up a temporary camp in the woods before heading back to town. Along the way, he would stop at a campsite to freshen up and then visit a bar in search of company. He preferred to observe quietly, noting those who seemed eager for conversation. If someone caught his attention, he would engage them politely, striking up conversations and asking about their lives. After moving from town to town, his actions eventually drew attention. One evening, while interacting with someone, he was surprised when the individual revealed themselves as an undercover officer. Before he could react, additional officers approached, and he was apprehended. While his physical presence came to an end, a lingering sense of unease seemed to remain. In the operating room where he was taken, some claimed to feel an unusual presence, though it was never confirmed. Over time, the memory of his actions faded, but stories of strange happenings in the room persisted, leaving people to wonder about the nature of his legacy. 3 months earlier in the same town, Timothy West was seated at his desk at Johnson Engineering, where he headed the engineering department. His responsibility was to ensure that any issues with their products were addressed promptly, both in the factory and on site. He had dispatched Carl Johnson, the owner's nephew, to resolve a problem in Penton, which was a 6-hour drive away. Carl and his team of 2 mechanics had been there for 3 days and were now returning after fixing the issue. The company manufactured compactors ranging from small, home-like can compactors to massive 30-ton units designed for crushing cars. When one of these large compactors malfunctioned, productivity plummeted, making swift and reliable service essential. This particular machine had broken down just 2 weeks earlier, and although Carl had reported it fixed, it had failed again 10 days later. Carl had informed Timothy that the problem was repaired and that they were on their way back. When Sam, the owner, called Timothy into his office to report that the compactor had broken down once more, the company insisted that Timothy handle the situation personally. Reluctant to engage in confrontation, Timothy agreed to go. He then called Chris to inform her that he would be out of town for a couple of days and needed to cancel their dinner reservation. Chris was upset, insisting she would go out regardless, and didn't understand why it should dampen her evening before abruptly ending the call. Timothy hung up and found himself wondering where the loving wife he once knew had gone. Timothy West, a 32-year-old honors graduate, earned a master's degree in engineering and a Bachelor of Science in computer science. He was average in most respects, standing 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighing 150 pounds when wet. Although he wasn't talented in sports, his high IQ of 150 allowed him to excel academically. While he had never started a fight, He had been assaulted a few times. Timothy stayed reasonably fit by going to the gym twice a week and was considered attractive by women. His main passions were his wife, Christine, and restoring cars, both vintage and newer models that insurance companies had deemed not cost-effective to repair. Christine, also 32 and married to Timothy for 9 years, held a nursing degree and worked at the local hospital 3 days each week. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighed 110 pounds, and had a model-like figure with measurements of 36, 23, 37, complemented by a smile that could brighten any room, though Timothy hadn't seen it much lately. Her primary interests were maintaining her appearance, which involved daily gym visits and spending money, mostly Timothy's, as she kept most of her earnings in her own account. Timothy managed all their expenses, including her car maintenance, fuel, rent for their large house that she desired, and all household bills. Additionally, he contributed to a joint account that Christine used for other expenditures. They married immediately after college and began their life together in a small apartment, initially planning to save for a down payment on a family home. Christine insisted on having separate bank accounts and never discussed her income with Timothy, yet she wanted a single joint account without contributing to it. When they announced their engagement, Christine's parents had a private conversation with Timothy. He expected a disapproving talk, but instead they issued a warning. They described Christine as a selfish woman who would take advantage of him, and cautioned about her tendency to spend money recklessly. They also mentioned that she was the most untidy person they knew. Despite these warnings, Timothy went ahead with the marriage and soon realized his parents were correct. Christine would drain their bank account halfway through the month and then complain about the lack of funds. She never saved money, instead leaving it scattered around the house, forcing Timothy to constantly clean up after her. Her car was cluttered with crumpled receipts and other trash, which Timothy had to tidy up weekly. On a positive note, Christine had a strong intimacy drive. They were intimate almost every night and twice during weekends. Timothy yearned for children, but Christine wanted to wait, so they postponed starting a family for 2 years. Now a supervisor at Johnson Engineering with a mid-5-figure salary, plus bonuses, Timothy chose to keep his earnings in a private account, anticipating that Christine would find ways to spend it. He intended to save it for their future children's education, keeping it hidden from her. Before Christine agreed to start a family, she insisted on moving to a larger house. Due to their limited savings, affected by her country club and gym memberships, new car payments, and social commitments, they decided to rent. They found a nice 3-bedroom house with a garden in a secure neighborhood, featuring shared pool, BBQ facilities, and a gym. Christine refused to change her gym because all her friends went there. As usual, Timothy conceded to her requests, being a passive person who preferred to avoid conflict. At work, Timothy was treated similarly. His subordinates called him Little Tim and didn't take him seriously, viewing him as a pushover. He never argued or stood his ground on any issue. After Christine stopped using the pill, they tried to conceive for a year without success, leading Timothy to undergo medical tests. He found that with his white liquid, which indicates that the problem is not with him. Christine also saw a doctor but chose to visit a family planning clinic instead of their family physician. She returned home in tears, claiming she couldn't have children and was barren. Timothy comforted her as best he could, but she seemed to withdraw emotionally. This affected their intimacy life, reducing it from almost every night to once a week or even less. She also became argumentative, starting disputes over trivial matters. About 6 months ago, she began belittling Timothy and criticizing him in front of friends and family. Naturally, Timothy continued to tolerate it as he always had. Unsurprisingly, He consented to address an issue that Carl and his team had once again been unable to resolve. Tim returned home to prepare a bag for a short trip. Upon entering the house, the first thing he noticed was the disarray. Breakfast dishes were still scattered on the table. Upstairs, he discovered clothes strewn across the bedroom, remnants of her indecision about what to wear, with the rejected items left haphazardly. He quickly cleaned up and washed the breakfast dishes before packing his bag for the journey. While driving to his hotel, Tim reflected on the recent months of his marriage. It all began at the company BBQ when Chris met Troy Sims, the new head of the legal department. Troy, a former NFL linebacker for the Ravens, had to retire due to a knee injury. Standing at 6 feet 6 inches and weighing 230 pounds, his imposing presence earned him the nickname Bear. From the outset, Troy was condescending toward Tim, openly mocking him by calling him Little Tim. He would stand on his tiptoes, shield his eyes as if searching for someone, and then feign surprise upon noticing Tim beside him. This behavior often ended with Troy laughing and saying, "It's just a joke, little buddy," leaving Tim embarrassed as he turned red and walked away. Not everyone in the office found Troy's antics amusing. The head of HR approached Tim, offering to reprimand Troy for his conduct, but Tim dismissed the offer, saying not to worry about it. The tension escalated during the first Saturday of June's BBQ. As Tim and Chris arrived and parked their car, Tim noticed Troy surrounded by his entourage near the bar. Chris, recognizing Troy, expressed her desire to meet him. Tim explained the strained relationship between him and Troy, describing Troy as an unpleasant person. As they approached to greet Mr. Johnson, the owner, Troy noticed Tim and Chris and called out, "Hi, Timmy, is that your big sister?" "She's too beautiful to be your wife. Ask her if she'd like to go out with a guy sometime." The comment caused a stunned silence. Realizing he had overstepped, Troy quickly added, "Just kidding, no offense, little buddy," while his friends laughed. What infuriated Tim further was seeing Chris giggle at Troy's joke. Feeling humiliated, Tim introduced Chris to his boss, Samuel, who advised him to ignore Troy and promised to address the issue later. Samuel's wife, May, apologized on Troy's behalf, labeling him as a typical jock and an unpleasant person. Tim dreaded the idea of having drinks with Troy and his followers, fearing further embarrassment. Fortunately, Chad Foster, the head of HR, noticed the situation and brought over some drinks. He stayed to chat, commending Tim's contributions and value to the company. Tim then invited Chris to get some food from the hog roast trailer. After waiting in a long line, he looked for Chris, but couldn't find her, assuming she had gone to the restroom. However, after some time without her return, he became concerned. May approached him to ask if something was wrong. When Tim expressed his worry about Chris, one of the women at their table mentioned seeing her walk away with Troy and indicated the direction they went. Fearing the worst, Tim quickly left with May to follow them. He rounded a set of bushes and saw Chris and Troy standing close together, engaged in a low conversation. When Chris saw him, she stammered and took a few steps back to maintain a respectful distance. "Hello, darling. Troy was just showing me the view over the lake." "Isn't it wonderful?" "Yes, very romantic, I'm sure." "What are you implying? We've done nothing wrong," Chris shouted. "Yeah, Timmy, calm down. We were just having some fun, no big deal," Troy replied with a smirk. "We're leaving now," Tim said, taking Chris's arm. She pulled her arm away and responded, "Stop acting like a spoiled schoolboy." "I'm staying." "Well, I'm going. I'm sure you'll find someone to give you a ride home," Tim retorted and walked toward the car. May stood and watched the entire scene, giving Chris a disapproving look. "If you value your marriage, you'd better catch up to him and apologize." Chris shot her a dirty look and went to catch up with her husband. May turned to the smirking Troy and said, "You can wipe that smirk off your face if you want to keep your job and stop hitting on other people's wives. The BBQ is over for you. Go home now." Troy knew better than to argue with May. His job truly depended on her, as she controlled all the finances. Chris caught up with Tim as he reached the car, but instead of opening the door for her, he walked around to the driver's side and got in. Tim always opened the car door for her, and she realized how angry he was. When they got home, as soon as they entered, she confronted him. What the fuck was that all about? He was just being friendly. "I told you when we arrived that we hated each other, and when he tried to bait me in front of everyone, you giggled along with the rest of them. How do you think that made me feel? My own wife laughing at me. Then, while I'm getting us some food, he gets you to go behind the bushes with him. We weren't doing anything wrong, we were just talking." "Well, you were talking very quietly and standing much too close, as you can tell by the guilty look on your face when you moved away. And it doesn't matter whether you were doing anything or not. It appeared to everyone that you were, including my boss's wife. He's probably bragging to all his flunkies about how he made out with you in front of me. I told you he was an asshole, but you didn't listen. All you saw was a big-shot football player and couldn't wait to drop your panties. Well, let me tell you, I don't want you seeing him again, or we will be reevaluating our relationship." Tim then went into his office and closed the door. Christine stood there stunned. Tim had never spoken to her like that before, and he always left his office door open. For the following week, the atmosphere at home was tense, and communication between them was limited to necessities. One evening, Chris approached Tim to apologize for her behavior, promising to make amends. She led him to the bedroom where their intimacy was hesitant at first, but gradually became more passionate, eventually falling asleep together. The next morning, Tim woke up before Chris and went downstairs to prepare breakfast. As he cooked, he reflected on the previous night. Although their intimacy had been enjoyable, he sensed something was missing. The special connection they once shared was absent. Pondering this, he headed to work still feeling unsettled and decided to surprise Chris by taking her out to lunch. He informed his personal assistant, Tina, a motherly figure who reminded him of his own mother, that he would be returning late from lunch and then left. Upon arriving at the hospital, he visited her ward and requested her to be paged. The nursing assistant behind the desk told him that Chris had already gone out to lunch with her husband. When Tim inquired about her husband, hoping he already knew the answer, she described him as Troy, the very person Tim despised. Realizing where she might have gone, Tim went to the diner to check. Peering through the window, he saw Chris and Troy sitting across from each other in a booth, conversing like old friends. He discreetly took a few photos, relieved to see they weren't touching or sitting next to each other, and then left. That evening, after returning from work and changing clothes, Tim asked Chris about her day. She responded casually, mentioning the usual hospital routine and nothing out of the ordinary. When he mentioned he had planned to surprise her with lunch, she looked guilty and said she had been called away. Tim assured her it was fine and mentioned he had gone out with some friends instead, suggesting she call him next time. The rest of the night passed as usual, with no intimacy or even a goodnight kiss. The following day, Tim waited outside the diner for Chris, only to see her with Troy once again. He followed them back to the hospital and was disturbed when Chris stood on her tiptoes to kiss Troy on the cheek. Tim captured a few clear photos with his phone. That night after dinner, he asked Chris about her day and received the same standard reply. When he inquired about lunch, She appeared guilty and repeated the story about dining with friends. Tim looked directly at her and said, "You've lied to me twice in 2 days. What else have you been dishonest about?" "What are you talking about? I've never lied to you," Chris retorted. "That makes it 3 times. Want to make it 4? I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't appreciate being called a liar. I'm going to bed. You can sleep on the couch. Good night." "Sit the frack down, you lying bitch," Tim shouted, something he had never done before. Chris recoiled in shock and sat back down. "I saw you with Troy both yesterday and today." "I'm sorry, it was nothing. We just had lunch. That's all." "So you didn't hold hands or kiss?" "No, of course not." "Then who were those 2 holding hands walking back to the hospital, and who was that kissing Troy outside the entrance?" Tim threw the photos across the table at her. Upon seeing the pictures, Chris broke down in tears. "Nothing happened. I swear nothing happened. It was just a friendly kiss between friends. Nothing romantic. Now you understand why I warned you about Troy. He's trying to drive a wedge between us, and it seems to be working. Why are you even seeing him?" "He just stopped by to apologize for the BBQ and to express his regret if it caused any trouble. He was just being friendly." "And the second time?" "He said he was just passing by and thought we might have lunch, so I agreed. I'm sorry I lied to you, but I knew you'd misunderstand and get angry like last time. You scared me. I've never seen you angry before. You're always so calm." "That's because my wife has never been unfaithful before. I'm not asking, I'm telling you not to see Troy anymore, or there will be consequences. You can't tell me who to be friends with. That's my business. You don't own me. I'll see whoever I want." With that, Chris went to bed and locked the door. The following morning was one of her days off. Typically, I would rise early, prepare breakfast, and deliver it to her on a tray. However, that morning I took a different approach. I showered in the guest bathroom, selected fresh clothes from the ironing pile, and headed to work. On my way, I stopped at Wendy's to grab breakfast. Upon arriving at work, I noticed Troy standing by the coffee machine with a couple of his buddies. As I passed by, he grinned and said, "How about lunch, Timmy? My usual lunch partner is tied up today. Want to join?" They all chuckled, and one even made a gesture by placing 2 fingers on each side of his head like horns, which made them laugh even harder. Entering my office, I overheard Troy telling the friend who made the horn gesture, "Not yet, but soon." I was furious that Chris had put me in this situation, so I called her to explain what had transpired. She just laughed, saying they were only having fun and I shouldn't take it personally. Sitting in my office, I pondered my next move and decided to make an effort to win my wife back from that jerk. I booked a table at her favorite restaurant for that evening and called her, asking her to be ready by 8. This decision led me to drive out to repair a machine that Carl Johnson should have already fixed. Curious about who Christine might bring to dinner, I reached out to an old school friend, Harry Price. Like me, he was a nerd, but he had earned a master's degree in computer technology and a bachelor's in electronics. He now ran a small security firm that primarily handled background checks for the government. We had stayed in touch over the years, so my call wasn't completely unexpected. When I shared my concerns, he immediately went into business mode. "Okay, I know what she looks like, but can you describe him?" I provided a detailed description, and when I mentioned the name, he said he could find his photo online. I told him I didn't need the information until after my trip to avoid any distractions. He agreed and said he would wait for me to reach out. Things took a disastrous turn when I was about 20 miles outside of town on the freeway. A semi-truck blew a tire, crossed the reservation, and sideswiped my car, causing me to lose control and slide down an embankment, ultimately ending up upside down in a ditch. Gunny. My intangible existence floated above the operating table, Doctors and nurses leaned over the patient lying there, striving to bring him back to life. They had already administered 2 electric shocks, and this was their final attempt. Clear. Thump. Thump. One more time, clear. Thump. Thump. No response, I'm calling it. Note the time. As he spoke, a being similar to mine separated from the body, though this one was almost white, whereas mine was nearly black. As we drew closer, I felt a force pulling us together, and we merged into a single dark gray entity. We were then seemingly pulled back into the body on the table, and the last thing I heard as Gunny was, "I don't believe it, we have a heartbeat." I lay there, hearing voices that seemed distant. It's a miracle. He was dead. There was no pulse and nothing on the monitor. Well, he's alive now and appears to be recovering, but I'm not sure he'll be able to walk again. I drifted back to sleep, noticing a bright light through my eyelids. I tried to open my eyes, but they felt stiff, as if glued shut. I think he's waking up. My eyelids finally opened and a blinding light filled my vision. "Mr. West? Can you hear me? Croak. Croak. Nurse, please get some ice chips." I felt a cold, wet sensation on my lips and tasted something pleasant. Stupid question. Where am I? You're in the hospital, Mr. West. Do you remember what happened? I was heading out on a call. I remember seeing a truck crash into the barrier and then nothing. Is my wife here? Yes, she's been here since the accident. She just went out for coffee and will return shortly. Why can't I feel my legs or move my arms? What's wrong with me? I won't lie to you, Mr. West. Your injuries are severe and your back is broken. Don't try to move, or you could cause more damage. At that moment, the door opened, and Chris walked in. Seeing that I was awake, she set her coffee down and hurried over to me. I couldn't move my head because it was restrained by some kind of device. She held my hand and gently kissed my lips. I felt water on my face and realized she was crying. "Oh, baby, thank God you're alive. I've been so worried. You've been in a coma for 3 days and they weren't sure you would ever wake up." I must have drifted off again because when I opened my eyes, I was alone. I pressed the nurse's buzzer and she came in promptly. "Has my wife gone home?" "Yes, Mr. West, but that was yesterday. She'll be back later. Would you like something to eat?" "No, but I'm very thirsty." The nurse brought me a glass with a straw. I never knew water could taste so good. I closed my eyes and fell back asleep. Chris visited me every day and stayed until the nursing staff asked her to leave. During this period, our company attorney visited and informed me that the semi-truck that struck me was deemed defective by the accident investigation team. He advised me to hire an attorney and pursue a lawsuit for damages. He recommended a friend and said he would be in contact. Harry Price heard about my accident and came to see me. He told me that Chris had dinner that night with Troy, whom he described as an asshole, and showed me pictures of them together. His investigator had followed them to a nightclub and obtained more photos of them dancing. There didn't appear to be anything inappropriate except that she was spending time with another man without her husband's knowledge. His investigator mentioned that Troy later dropped her off at our home and warned me that the next picture wouldn't be good. She didn't invite him inside, but did kiss him, which certainly wouldn't pass the hubby test. I asked him to continue the surveillance, and he confirmed he hadn't stopped. He then informed me that she had lunch with Troy every day since and went out dancing twice more. Each time she didn't invite him in, but the kisses became longer. I gave him my house keys and asked if he could install cameras in the house for me. He agreed, so I had him write a letter to the security guards at the compound gate, granting him permission to enter our home. It also stated that my wife should not be informed of their entry. I signed the letter and gave it to Harry, confident that the guards wouldn't inform my wife since I was the only one on the rental agreement. That afternoon, a man introduced himself as George Faith, the attorney recommended to me. We talked for over an hour, and it was decided he would file a claim for damages totaling $10 million. He mentioned that we might only receive half of that amount, but since it was their fault that I would likely never walk again, he was confident. I signed a retainer agreement, and he left. That evening, I awaited Chris's visit, aware that our marriage hinged on her response to my requests. At exactly 6 p.m., the visiting hours began, and Chris entered my room. We sat down and discussed my circumstances for a while before I brought up the obvious issue. Chris, that night when I had my accident, you mentioned you were planning to go out. Did you go? No, honey, I just didn't feel like it. Do you recall when I asked you not to see Troy anymore, and you replied that you could meet whoever you wanted and that it wasn't my concern? She began to fidget with her hands and avoided making eye contact. Well, do you? Of course, sweetheart, I'm sorry about that. You just made me angry and I didn't mean it. So, you haven't seen Troy since then? No, absolutely not. I wouldn't go against your wishes. You're my husband. Have you ever heard the saying, 3 strikes and you're out? It's from baseball. If a batter misses the ball 3 times, they're automatically out. Yes, but how is that relevant? Well, you've lied to me twice tonight, and if you lie again, our marriage might not survive. She became defensive and almost shouted, I've never lied to you. What gives you the right to call me a liar? I reached beneath my covers and pulled out an envelope containing photos that Harry had given me. The first lie was when you said you never went out that night. I handed her a picture of her having dinner with Troy. She looked at the photo, gasped, and covered her mouth with her hand. I then showed her a picture of her dancing with Troy, and she began to cry. The second lie is that you said you hadn't been seeing Troy, yet you've been having lunch with him every day since my accident. Not only that, but you've gone dancing with him on 2 other occasions. Can you explain? I'm so sorry. I swear nothing happened. We just talked. He's not who you think he is. When you had your accident, he came by to check on you, and we went to lunch. I felt much better having someone to talk to, and he was very understanding and sympathetic. Yes, we went dancing, but he was a complete gentleman and never tried to take advantage. I never mentioned it because I know how much you dislike him, but he's really a nice guy. Tears streamed down her face. Think carefully before answering this question. Our marriage might depend on it. Have you ever kissed him? I could see her contemplating. How much does he know? He seemed aware of everything else. Maybe if I hesitate, I could get away with it. Yes, I kissed him once on the cheek to thank him for being there, but it meant nothing. I only love you. That's 3 strikes. You're out. I handed her photos of her kissing Troy in 3 different places. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she began to sob. Oh God, I'm so sorry. I never intended for this to happen. It just felt so natural. And I had been drinking, so my judgment was clouded. Please forgive me. I promise it will never happen again. I can't express how much this affects our marriage, but at the very least, we'll need to attend counseling to try and fix things. Luckily, it didn't go beyond a kiss. If you had invited him into our home or gone back to his place, we would be getting a divorce. If that's what you want, then say it now, and we can end things. I don't want a divorce. I love you. And I didn't want a disrespectful wife, but that's what I have now. Tim, I'm sorry. I promise I'll make it up to you if you give me the chance. Chris, I don't want a divorce either, but I can't stay in a marriage built on lies. This is your last chance. If you see him again, we're done. Do you understand what I'm saying? I promise. Just then, the buzzer rang, signaling the end of the visit. Chris came over, kissed me, and whispered, I promise. Then she left. I was utterly exhausted, both physically and emotionally, and went straight to sleep. The next day, Harry visited me, and I could tell from his expression that he was upset. He sat down in the armchair and looked at me. "Tim, I'm so sorry, but I have bad news. Troy came over to your house and stayed the night." My heart broke instantly, and I began to cry. Harry placed his hand on my shoulder. "Tim, it wasn't entirely her fault. He drugged her. The video clearly shows him putting something in her drink. Harry, it doesn't matter what he did. She promised me she wouldn't see him again. She put herself in a situation to be drugged, so it's her own fault. Do you have video evidence of her infidelity?" "Yes, do you want to see it?" "It's not pleasant to watch." "Not right now, but can you make a couple of copies for me? And since today is one of her workdays, she won't be home until 6. I need you to do something for me." I provided him with a list of tasks I needed completed, and he assured me he could finish everything before she returned home. My phone had been damaged in the accident, so I asked Harry to get me a new one and transfer all my data to it. I also requested a pay-as-you-go SIM card. Then I borrowed his phone and called the attorney handling my claim, asking for a recommendation for a good divorce lawyer. He said he would get back to me. Harry left to carry out my instructions. I cried bitterly for the loss of my wife and our marriage. Christine. After leaving the hospital, I felt awful. I had hurt my husband and jeopardized our marriage. Determined to make things right, I went straight home and called Troy to tell him I couldn't see him anymore because Tim had discovered our relationship and threatened to divorce me. Troy insisted on coming over to discuss it, and I reluctantly agreed, though deep down I was conflicted about seeing him again. When he arrived and I opened the door, he entered quickly, clearly emotional. As we talked, he confessed that he was falling in love with me. I was stunned and struggled to find the right words to respond. We sat down, and he opened up about how he had felt since meeting me. His words were heavy with emotion, and I could see how much he was hurting. I tried to console him, but the weight of the situation was overwhelming. Later, as we continued talking, I realized that I had to make a decision. I loved my husband and wanted to save my marriage, but the connection I had with Troy was undeniable. When he began to cry, I put my arm around him to comfort him, but I made it clear that we couldn't continue like this. The evening ended with Troy leaving, and I was left to face my own thoughts and feelings. The guilt weighed heavily on me, but so did the reality of the choices I had made. When I got home the next day, I noticed Tim's truck was missing, and the Mercedes SLK he had been working on was also gone from the garage. Feeling uneasy, I rushed inside. The house felt strangely empty. Tim's favorite recliner was missing from the lounge, and the office door was open, revealing that his desk, chair, and computer were gone. The photos on the wall were shattered, except for the ones of me. Upstairs in the bedroom, I saw the signs of a rushed departure. Tim's clothes were gone, along with all his personal belongings. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Tim had left, and he wasn't coming back. I sat on the bed, overwhelmed by everything that had happened, wondering how I would fix the mess I had created. I quickly changed my clothes and drove to the hospital. However, when I arrived at the floor where Tim's room was located, a nurse stopped me. She informed me that Tim had instructed her not to allow me entry and handed me an envelope. I attempted to reason with her, but she firmly stated that security would be called if I didn't leave. Reluctantly, I exited and sat in my car, opening the envelope. Inside were photos of me meeting Troy at our home and a note that read, "You were warned." Overwhelmed with emotion, I broke down in tears, realizing I had caused this situation and now had to face the consequences. 3 days later, while waiting at the information desk for some paperwork, a woman in a professional suit approached me. "Are you Mrs. Christine West?" she asked. I confirmed, and she handed me a manila envelope stating, "You have been served." She took a photo and walked away. Trembling, I tried to open the envelope but fumbled and dropped it, scattering papers. My friends and colleagues helped me gather them, but their disapproving looks stung. By the end of the day, my actions were widely known throughout the hospital. The divorce petition cited irreconcilable differences and included a restraining order preventing me from approaching Tim's residence or workplace. I thought things couldn't worsen, but upon returning home, I found a letter stating I had 1 week to vacate the property as Tim had terminated the lease. While processing this, the phone rang. It was Troy, who mentioned he had been served a lawsuit and asked if I knew where Tim was. I told him Tim was still in the hospital but unavailable. When I asked if he could meet for lunch the next day, he postponed. I then inquired if he was coming over that night, and he said he was busy before hanging up. Sitting there, I realized Tim had been right. Troy had come between us, and now I was left seeking his attention. The following day, I tried to pay for gas with my usual card, but it was declined. I quickly used another card, which worked, but it was clear I needed to investigate. Attempts to call Tim went unanswered, and his number appeared disconnected. I decided to email him when I got home. Meanwhile, at work, I noticed my friends and colleagues were avoiding me. On my next day off, I contacted the bank and discovered Tim had taken half of our savings and canceled my card. I arranged for a new one to be sent. My next call was to the letting agent, who allowed me to take over the lease, though at a higher rate. I also had to restore utilities, which Tim had canceled, forcing me to manage my finances more carefully. Over the next few weeks, I saw Troy occasionally, but our interactions grew strained. He became distant, and it was clear that our relationship wasn't built to last. As the months passed, I had no contact with Tim, only with his attorney. I hired my own lawyer to manage the divorce proceedings, and although the process was emotionally draining, I knew I had to move forward. Life was now about rebuilding and reflecting on my choices, and while it was difficult, I remained determined to find a way through. Tim. Harry returned to inform me that everything was completed and stored at a facility across town. He also handed me my new phone with the updated SIM card. I shared my new number with trusted individuals, ensuring it wouldn't reach Chris. I wasn't expecting any visitors that evening, so I was pleasantly surprised when May, my boss's wife, stopped by. "Hi, Tim. How are you?" "Thanks for coming to see me. I'm doing okay, but I could be better." "Look, Tim, I understand you've hired an attorney to pursue your claim against the trucking company, and you have our full support. However, you should be aware that you also have a claim against us since you were on company business when the accident occurred. Currently, you're receiving full pay and your position is secure. If your attorney files a formal claim against us, we will offer a substantial settlement. But he needs to initiate the claim so we can process it through our insurance. This won't affect your job, but we need to follow the proper procedures. I really appreciate you looking out for me, and I'll discuss this with my attorney the next time I see him." At that moment, Harry entered with a short, stout woman in her mid-50s, whom he introduced as Carol Cobb. I noticed May's eyes widen as she glanced at me inquisitively. "I'm sorry, introductions are necessary. Mrs. Johnson, this is George Faith, my attorney handling my claim, and Carol Cobb, my divorce attorney." May looked at me, her eyes questioning. "I'm sorry, May. I was about to tell you that I'm planning to divorce my wife for adultery." She simply looked at me and asked, "Who?" "Troy Sims, of course." May nodded and sat down, making it clear she wasn't going anywhere. George turned to me, and I gestured for him to proceed. He went into the hall, returned with 2 more chairs, and sat down with Carol. George began updating me on the progress of the claim. Once he was done, he excused himself and left. Carol then asked if I had any evidence of Chris's infidelity. I replied that I had photos and a video. She inquired if I had them on hand. I said I had some photos but was waiting for the video. She requested to see the photos, and I handed them over. As she reviewed them, May stood up and positioned herself behind Carol, and I heard her take a sharp breath. Suddenly, both Carol and I were taken aback when May exclaimed, "That no-good, slimy piece of trash seducing a man's wife while he's in the hospital, and she's no better. I'm going to fire his ass first thing tomorrow. Then I'll get her fired too. I donate a lot to the hospital she works at. Time for some payback." Damn, she was furious. Carol interjected, "Could you please hold off on that for a moment? If she loses her job, Tim's spousal support will increase significantly. However, if she remains employed and earns enough to support herself, he might not have to pay anything at all. Additionally, if he files a claim against Mr. Sims for alienation of affection while he's unemployed, it will likely be dismissed. The claim might not progress anyway, but it would at least cause him some embarrassment. Once the divorce is finalized, you can proceed to fire him and have her terminated as well." May agreed to wait for the time being. She then mentioned she had to leave, gave me a kiss on the forehead, and departed. Carol proceeded to ask me several questions, requesting proof of Chris's income and our financial situation. She also provided me with advice on how to secure my finances. I asked if I could obtain a restraining order against her, and she consented. Carol then inquired about when to serve her with the divorce petition. I responded that it should be done as soon as possible, preferably at her workplace. I went on to explain my actions and future plans, and she stated that everything was legal since only my name was on the rental agreement before leaving me in distress. The following day, I contacted the letting agent to terminate my tenancy immediately. I also inquired if he had any ground-floor apartments available within a 5-mile radius. He informed me that there was a secure compound just 2 miles from my current home. When he asked why I was leaving, I gave a brief explanation, and he agreed to serve Chris with an eviction notice the next day. I paid a deposit and the first month's rent. Next, I turned to managing my finances. I contacted the bank to pay off my credit cards and close the joint account, but they informed me this had to be done in person. I paid off the cards and canceled them with the credit company. Then, I opened a new line of credit in my name. I called Carol to update her, and she advised me to leave a minimal balance in the joint account, which I did. That day, the surgeon visited me. After reviewing some scans, he noted that the swelling had subsided, and surgery could proceed. The operation was scheduled for the following Monday. When Tim woke up on Tuesday, he was surprised to see May sitting in an armchair reading a magazine. He attempted to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. Hearing his effort, May called a nurse, who brought him ice chips to help his throat. After a few moments, Tim asked May why she was there. She replied that since he had no one else, she wanted to support him. He tried to smile, but the pain in his back was intense. Glancing down, he saw his body encased in a cast from neck to hips, lying on a special bed that tilted to allow normal eating. He thanked May for her presence and became emotional, realizing how isolated he had been. He drifted back to sleep and awoke from a dream feeling disoriented. A nurse entered, noticing his elevated heart rate. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Just a bad dream," Tim replied. "The doctor will want to see you now that you're awake," the nurse said, and stepped out. A few minutes later, the doctor arrived. "Mr. West, the surgery went better than expected. Your spine had aligned itself, and the swelling was minimal. I stabilized your back with a plate, and with continued recovery, there's no reason you shouldn't regain full mobility. I recommend starting rehabilitation soon. What do you think?" "That sounds good. When do I leave?" Tim responded. "You can go tomorrow. I'll arrange transportation to a nearby rehabilitation center," the doctor replied. The next day, I was transported to a clinic 50 miles away to begin my recovery. After my cast was removed, I started physical therapy, focusing on regaining strength and mobility. The surgeon who operated on me visited during my stay. "Mr. West, your recovery is remarkable. Your weight has increased and your muscle tone is exceptional, completely unexpected after such an injury. There's also a scar forming near your face. Did you sustain an injury there before?" "No, I don't recall anything like that." "Could it be related to the crash?" "There's no record of it, but we'll monitor it. The good news is that your stabilizing plate can be removed soon, and you may be discharged in 2 weeks." Meanwhile, Harry kept me updated on Chris's situation. After leaving the hospital, she returned to our previous home. She had been served with a notice but managed to retain the lease. Harry also noted that Troy frequently visited and stayed overnight. He ensured that any relevant information would be documented for my divorce proceedings. I thanked him for moving my belongings to my new apartment, and he joked that I owed him a beer. After my swift recovery, I was finally discharged from the clinic. Harry picked me up and took me to my new apartment, which I had never seen before. We parked next to my truck in the secure underground parking lot and headed to my new home. Upon entering, I was greeted with a loud shout of surprise. My workmates, led by May, were waiting for me. May threw her arms around me in a bear-like hug and whispered, "Welcome home." There were also a few unfamiliar faces, who I later learned were the welcome committee from our apartment building. I was particularly taken by a well-proportioned redhead and decided I wanted to get to know her better. May and Harry had collaborated to finish furnishing the apartment. Everything I needed was there. My computer was set up, and a brand new TV hung on the wall. I was overwhelmed with joy, started crying, and hugged everyone, realizing that I wasn't alone and that I had friends. The next day, I scheduled an appointment with my claims attorney for the afternoon. He informed me that the trucking company had offered $3 million, but he believed he could secure at least $5 million if I waited, and I agreed. He also mentioned that May had contacted him after he filed a claim against Johnson's. After a brief negotiation, they agreed to compensate me with $1.3 million and to retain me as head of engineering. He said he had accepted their offer on my behalf, and the check was deposited into my separate account away from my wife. As I drove around my new neighborhood, enjoying the experience of driving and getting to know the local shops, restaurants, and amenities, I noticed a gym. On a whim, I decided to join one, so I parked and walked over to Sam's gym and MMA training facility. Upon entering, the strong sense of sweat, liniment, and leather hit my nostrils. It was an old-fashioned gym with free weights, a boxing ring, and various leather punching bags. There was also a large matted area for sparring. As I stood there, a man exited the sparring area and approached me. "Can I help you?" Yeah. I'm thinking of joining a gym to build up a bit. I've been unwell lately and need to get into shape." "Okay, we can certainly help with that. Come into the office and we'll talk." That marked the start of my journey into MMA. Over the next 3 months, I incorporated running, weightlifting, swimming, and various martial arts into my routine. By the end, I had built up to 180 pounds of muscle and was more than capable of holding my own in the ring. I had a plan and shared it with Sam. He found the idea amusing and wanted to get involved, asking how he could assist. At one point, we went over the details while having a beer. "All right, Tim, now that we're friends, tell me the truth. You used to be in the Special Forces, didn't you?" "Sam, I swear on my mother's grave I've never served. In fact, before joining your gym, I'd never been in a fight in my life." "Well, Tim, from the beginning, I could tell you were a natural. Your skill level is more like someone who's been trained to fight their entire life. All I can say is, you must have been one tough guy in a past life." Reflecting on when I first moved in, I joined a gym, so instead of driving, I would run both ways as part of my training schedule. One evening, as I was entering my apartment, I noticed a young girl, about 8 or 9 years old, sitting outside an apartment down the hallway. I remembered the redhead from my party, and thought this little girl might be her sister, so I assumed it was her apartment. I approached her and asked if she was okay since she seemed a bit scared. She told me she had returned from school, but her mother wasn't home as she usually was. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't just leave her there, and it wouldn't be right to invite her into my apartment to wait alone. I didn't really know anyone in the building except for the security guard on duty. I knocked on a few doors but got no responses. I asked her if she had a phone to call her mother, and she said she had tried, leaving a message and a text. I suggested we go together to see the security guard downstairs, and she agreed. When I explained the situation to the guard, he said they had a procedure for such cases and called the police. When they arrived, we all went to my apartment to talk. That's how I learned her name was Amanda and her mother's name was Lindy. While we talked, I offered her some milk and cookies, and she began to calm down. She mentioned that she and her mother lived alone, but her mother was always there when she came home. The police officer attempted to have social services come and take her, but they informed him that no officer would be available for several hours. They then requested to speak with Amanda, asking if she had a babysitter, where she lived, and if she knew her contact number. The babysitter lived on the floor above, so we visited her. She agreed to care for Amanda until we could find her mother. I accompanied the policeman back to my apartment, and he began by inspecting her workplace. She worked as an accountant at a local small engineering firm and mentioned that she had left work at her usual time to go home to her daughter. The police officer asked if they could check whether her car was still in the parking lot, but they said it wasn't. They provided the make and model of the car, but didn't know the registration number. He quickly obtained that information and issued a BOLO, be on the lookout, for the license plate. He then called the hospitals and discovered that a woman matching Lindy's description had been found unconscious in an alley. The attending officer believed it was a botched mugging, with no trace of her car or personal belongings. We went to the babysitter and explained the situation, and she agreed to watch Amanda overnight. The officer mentioned he was going to the hospital, and I asked if I could go with him, requesting to change first. Initially, he seemed a bit annoyed but agreed. Upon arriving at the hospital, we were taken to her room, which was a 6-bed ward. I inquired why she didn't have her own room, and they responded that they weren't sure if she had insurance, so they placed her in a public ward. I went to the front desk and insisted on speaking with the administrator. When she arrived, I demanded that Lindy be moved to a private room with all the amenities and her own nurse, offering to sign the necessary paperwork and provide surety. Their attitude immediately improved and progress was made. The police officer looked at me as if I were from another planet. "How well do you know this woman?" he asked. "Actually, not at all, but she's a neighbor in trouble and I can help," I replied. A doctor came to see us now that we were private, money talks, and explained that Lindy had suffered a head injury and might not wake up for hours or even days. The officer took some notes, said he was leaving, and asked if I needed a ride. I said I would stay for a while, and he departed. I visited the gift shop, bought a couple of magazines, and settled in for the night on an uncomfortable chair. The next morning, the doctor came in to review her charts. He lifted her eyelids and shone a flashlight to check her pupils' dilation. As he was leaving, she moaned, prompting him to return and check her vitals. As he did so, she opened her eyes. "Where am I?" she asked. "You're in the hospital. Do you remember what happened?" "Yes. 2 men dragged me out of my car, and one of them hit me. I don't remember anything else." "You're in good hands. We'll inform the police that you're awake, so expect a visit." "I can't stay here. My daughter will be worried sick." I stood up. "She's okay. The babysitter is taking care of her." "Who are you? I know you from somewhere." "You were one of the people who welcomed me to my apartment. I'm your neighbor, remember?" "But how did you—" "Shh, just rest. I'll bring Amanda to see you tonight. Is there anything you need me to bring?" She gave me a list and I left. Back at my apartment, I showered and changed, then went to the babysitter to pick up Amanda and informed her that her mother was safe but in the hospital. Amanda had numerous questions, but I had few answers. The babysitter had a spare key to Lindy's apartment, so we went there, and Amanda packed a bag with the items on Lindy's list. Since Amanda had taken the day off from school due to a family emergency, there were no issues there. Amanda insisted on changing, so I returned to my apartment to wait. When she came back, she looked adorable as only a 9-year-old can, even putting her hair in a ponytail like her mother liked. It was still too early to visit Lindy, so I took Amanda to McDonald's for her evening meal, earning plenty of brownie points for that. It was still a bit early, so we grabbed milkshakes and went to the park to feed the ducks and chat. I learned that Lindy was divorced, had left the country, and no one knew his whereabouts. He hadn't tried to contact either Lindy or Amanda and had never paid child support. All of this information came from a 9-year-old while we were feeding ducks and drinking milkshakes. I decided right then never to underestimate young children. When we arrived at the hospital, Lindy was sitting upright, engrossed in one of the magazines I had brought along. The moment she saw Amanda, her face instantly brightened, and they embraced tightly for a whole minute. Lindy informed Amanda that she had suffered an accident, but was recovering. Due to the persistent swelling in her brain, Lindy had to stay in the hospital for a week. On Friday morning, I picked her up and brought her home, although she still needed to rest for at least another 2 weeks. She was reluctant to go to bed, so I insisted she relax on the couch. I went to the kitchen to make some coffee, and upon returning I found her gently snoring. With Amanda scheduled to return home in about 2 hours, I began preparing a meal for them. Amanda burst in, shouting, "I'm home," before noticing that her mother was asleep. Lindy didn't wake up, so Amanda came over and hugged me. There's something uniquely touching about a child's embrace, and I found myself tearing up as I hugged her back. She looked up at me and said, "Thank you for taking care of us. I really like you, and I think my mommy does too." I finished preparing dinner, mac and cheese, a salad, and ice cream for dessert. Amanda woke Lindy with a kiss and announced, "Dinner is served." Lindy smiled at me and said, "Thank you. You didn't have to do all this, but I'm very grateful." I plated the food and was about to leave, but they insisted I join them. After dinner, I assisted Amanda with her homework, and we watched her favorite movie together before it was time for her to go to bed. Lindy began to get up, but Amanda requested that I put her to bed and read her a story. I glanced at Lindy, who nodded in agreement, so I told Amanda to change into her pajamas and call me when she was ready. I went to her room, careful to leave the door slightly open. She handed me her favorite book, and I turned to the bookmarked page to start reading. About 10 minutes later, her eyes closed, and she had fallen asleep. I marked the page and placed the book back on the shelf. Before leaving, I did something I never imagined. I leaned over and kissed her forehead. As I was about to exit, she whispered in her sleep, "Love you, Tim." I stood there stunned and unsure of how to respond, convinced she was asleep and likely unaware of her words. When I sat down across from Lindy, she noticed something was wrong. After I explained what had happened, she laughed and mentioned that Amanda had already told her how she felt. I was speechless, sitting there unable to comprehend the situation. It was getting late, so I cleaned up the dinner dishes and prepared to leave. However, when I opened the door, Lindy was standing beside me. As I gazed at her, she leaned forward and gently kissed me on the lips. "That's our way of saying thank you for everything you've done. We truly appreciate it." I returned to my own apartment, closing the door behind me. I could still feel her lips on mine, and my little one began to stir. Over the next few weeks, we grew closer and shared many dinners together. Sometimes we dined at their place, and other times I took them out. When we were at their apartment, I would read Amanda a story until she fell asleep, after which Lindy and I would sit and chat until it was time for me to leave. During one of our conversations, I shared my sad story, ending with tears in my eyes. I admitted that I knew her story and that Amanda had revealed the details while feeding ducks. Lindy found that hilarious and agreed with me never to underestimate a young child. We began dating, always with Amanda around. We spent a long weekend at Disneyland, Florida, staying in separate rooms, of course. Amanda was starting to feel like the daughter I never had, and Lindy and I were very close, but I was afraid to take the next step and potentially ruin everything. One morning, there was a knock on my door, and Lindy and Amanda were standing there. Lindy invited me over for dinner that night because she wanted to discuss something with me. I had a bad feeling about it and glanced at Amanda, who just giggled. That evening, I went to Lindy's place and knocked. She welcomed me in, wearing her housecoat, motioned for me to sit down, and took a seat across from me. Then I heard those dreaded words, "We need to talk." I felt sick inside and wanted to leave, but as I stood up, she asked where I thought I was going. I admitted that I thought she wanted to end our friendship. "No, I need to understand why you haven't even tried to kiss me. I know you're not gay, so is it something about me?" "Absolutely not. You're everything I've ever wanted. Perfect. I just didn't want to push you away." "Thank God for that. Come here now." She stood up, motioning me over with a shy but inviting smile. Her warmth and presence were captivating, and I felt a deep connection between us. She approached and gave me a kiss, gentle at first, but filled with passion and emotion. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, savoring the moment. We spent the evening together, sharing stories, laughter, and tender moments that brought us closer than ever. The night was filled with an intimacy that went beyond words, a bond that felt unbreakable. The next morning, I woke up to the aroma of sizzling bacon. I got out of bed refreshed and happy and walked into the kitchen. There she was, dressed in a cozy robe, preparing breakfast. She turned and smiled, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Do you regret last night?" I asked gently. "No, do you?" she replied, looking into my eyes. "Never. It was one of the best nights of my life, and you are the most amazing woman I've ever met." We embraced, a quiet understanding passing between us. The connection we had built felt like the beginning of something truly special. After enjoying breakfast together, we went to pick up Amanda. Since it was Saturday and there was no school or work, we decided to take Amanda to the cinema to watch the latest Frozen movie. Later, we headed to McDonald's for lunch. While we were sitting there enjoying our milkshakes, Amanda, in her sweet little voice, asked me, "So, are you going to be my new daddy now?" Lindy and I almost choked on our milkshakes, but I decided to respond. "Would you like me to be?" "Yes, more than anything. Can he, Mom, please?" "Stop it, Amanda. You're putting Tim in a tough spot. We haven't even talked about it yet." "I'm sorry, Tim. You must feel awful." "Actually, I'm grateful to Amanda. I was too scared to ask you myself." "So, to answer your question, Amanda, I would love to be your new daddy if your mom agrees." Lindy looked like she was about to cry, but simply nodded and squeezed my hand. "Yes, yes, and yes. Amanda, this is your fault, so you'll have to put up with us while we go ring shopping." Amanda playfully jumped at me, accidentally knocking over my drink. I promised to be the best daughter ever. In the afternoon, we went ring shopping and discovered a small jewelry store on a side street that offered a variety of engagement rings. I noticed Lindy gazing longingly at some vintage rings. When she requested to see a selection of reasonably priced rings, I also asked to view the ones she was interested in. She looked at me, and I encouraged her to choose a ring without worrying about the price. She selected a gorgeous diamond ring accented with small rubies and tried it on. It fit perfectly. I told the shop assistant that we would purchase it, and Lindy gave me a warm hug while Amanda just laughed. When we returned home, Amanda insisted that we show the babysitter my mother's ring. Mrs. Ross expressed her happiness for us and asked about our wedding plans. I explained that I was going through a divorce and couldn't make any plans yet. That evening, after Amanda went to bed, we sat together on the couch. I mentioned that I would be going back to work the following Monday, as I had already arranged it with May, who was excited to see me again. The next day, I met with Harry, who said he had a lot to discuss. I arrived at his office just after 10. He sat me down and began a video presentation. Harry had uncovered evidence that Troy had been engaging in unethical activities. He shared details about Troy's involvement in shady dealings, but it was clear that further steps were needed to address the situation. Harry paused the discussion and turned to me. "Tim, I know this is about your divorce, but this has become much bigger. We need to go to the authorities." I sat and thought for a few minutes. What if I can get Troy to admit to his plans on tape? Would that work? Yeah, that would do it, but how are you going to persuade Troy to admit to wrongdoing? I have a plan. I'll use his arrogance against him and get my revenge. Just leave it to me. What I need you to do is this. I gave him a list of instructions. My next call was to Sam, asking him to arrange a meeting for next Friday night, and I would send him the rest of the instructions later. I then called May to ask if it was all right for me to return to work on Monday. She agreed and asked if I wanted Troy and Carl fired before then. I told her not to, as I had a plan for them, and then I informed her of their questionable actions. She was shocked and very angry, asking what I was going to do. I replied that it would all become clear on Monday. I arrived at work early on Monday to prepare everything. I placed a sound-activated recorder beneath my desk and concealed a motion-sensitive micro camera on the bookcase. After that, I tackled the surprisingly minimal backlog of tasks. As the office started to fill up, I stepped outside my office. My PA, Tina, was just booting up her computer when she noticed me exiting. "Oh, Mr. West, it's great to see you looking so well. Are you staying for good?" "You look good too, and yes, I'm back for good." At that moment, I saw Troy heading to the coffee machine, followed by Carl and some of their associates. This was my opportunity. I approached Troy, who gave me a disdainful look. "Hey, Timmy boy, how's the wife?" His comment elicited chuckles from his group. "I wouldn't know. She's spending time with someone who takes advantage of others while they're vulnerable, but you already knew that, didn't you?" There was a tense silence, and Troy looked ready to lash out, but Carl held him back. "Not here. There are people around. We'll deal with this later." I smirked and looked at Troy. "Don't they call you the bear?" "If so, I guess that makes me a terrier, because I'm not afraid to challenge you until you stop hiding behind your friends. So, what do you say, Troy? Ready for a one-on-one, or are you backing down?" "I'll take you on, no question," Troy snapped. "Talk is easy. Let's settle this in the ring, just you and me, and to make it interesting, let's place a bet. Anytime, any place, you name it." "And what's the bet?" Troy asked. "If I win, I get your car, your house, and $20,000. If you win, you get my truck, the SLK Mercedes, $20,000. And this." I held up a recording device. Troy frowned. "What's on that?" "Come to my office and we'll discuss it. You too, Carl. This concerns both of you." Their expressions changed, and they followed me to my office. Inside, I sat at my desk while they stood, as I'd removed the other chairs. I pressed play on the recording device and watched as their expressions darkened. "You know what this is, don't you?" They nodded. "It confirms a series of manipulations, targeting vulnerable individuals, profiting at their expense and using them for your schemes. You even set up accidents to eliminate obstacles. Sound familiar?" Carl glanced at Troy nervously. "What do you want?" "It's simple. Meet me in the ring, and if you win, this recording is yours, along with the rest of the bet. But if I win, everything you've built through these schemes is mine. Do we have a deal? Troy smirked. You've got it, and I'll make sure you regret ever challenging me. Good. Now that we've agreed, you can both head back to work. They left without another word, but I could see the tension in their steps as they walked out of my office. I removed the recording devices and sent the information to Harry. Then I opened my briefcase and took out the flyers I had prepared earlier, inviting everyone to the match and providing the address. I called Georg, my attorney, to draft the terms of our agreement. On the night of the event, my attorney and Troy's attorney would obtain our signatures of consent. Each attorney would hold the other's client's documents and a check for $20,000 made out to their opponent. Friday evening arrived, and I was waiting for Troy to emerge from the dressing rooms. I was already in the ring, sitting in my corner wearing a robe with the hood up. Troy entered in a similar robe, raising his hands confidently. He climbed into the ring, performed a few playful moves, and threw some shadow punches into the air. He tossed his robe to Chris, who caught it with a smile. I felt a moment of hesitation. I stood up and handed my robe to Lindy, who had insisted on attending. I noticed a fleeting look of frustration on Christine's face. We stood facing each other, the larger fighter against the quicker one. I wore athletic shorts ending just above the knee, fight boots, and sparring gloves. Troy was dressed in traditional boxing gear. My haircut was sharp and short, giving me a focused, determined look. With my robe off, my defined muscles were visible, catching some attention from the crowd. Even some of Troy's supporters seemed a bit unsure. The referee entered the ring. This match will continue until one of the competitors is unable to proceed. There are a few rules: no biting, no eye gouging, and respect for safety. Understood? We nodded, and he directed us to the center of the ring to inspect our gloves. Return to your corners and start fighting at the bell. The bell rang, and we approached each other, circling cautiously. Troy threw a quick jab that I dodged easily. I grinned and said lightly, "Is that your best shot?" He seemed annoyed and followed up with a wide kick. I was ready for it, stepping out of the way and gently redirecting his momentum, causing him to stumble. The crowd murmured as I took a moment to gesture playfully. Troy got back up, clearly determined. He charged forward, aiming to grab hold of me, but I kept my distance, staying light on my feet. As he came close, I evaded his grasp and delivered a few clean strikes to his sides. Each hit was calculated, aimed to wear him down without unnecessary aggression. Eventually, Troy knelt, signaling his exhaustion. The referee stepped in and raised my hand as the crowd erupted in cheers. The match was over, and both sides exchanged respectful nods. Chris looked reflective, and Lindy smiled, giving me a thumbs up. It was a night of intensity, but also one of sportsmanship and resolve. I stepped out of the ring and approached two men in dark suits. "He's all yours, gentlemen," I said with a nod. They both chuckled, and one replied, "We'll pick him up from the hospital in a week or two. Nice work." Troy was unable to move and was taken to the ambulance, while Carl, attempting to flee, was intercepted by deputies who escorted him away in handcuffs. My next stop was a meeting with my attorney, who had witnessed everything and was busy collecting on our bet. Troy's attorney handed over the necessary documents transferring ownership of Troy's car and house, along with their contents. My attorney gave me the keys, and I immediately passed the house keys to a locksmith I had ready to change the locks. Sam walked over with a grin and gave me a high five. "I've never seen anything like it. You took him down in front of everyone and made him look foolish. People will be talking about this for years. I might even sell the video." Lindy came over to congratulate me with a warm smile and a hug. Shortly after, May approached, and I introduced her to Lindy. "This is my future wife," I said with a proud smile. May suggested we have dinner soon, and then left. As the crowd began to disperse, Even some of Troy's associates approached to express their surprise and share a few kind words about how I'd been treated. The next day, I received a text from Chris asking if I could meet her at our old house. I agreed, but let her know I'd be bringing Lindy along. We arrived at the scheduled time and stepped inside. Chris sat at the dining table looking exhausted and upset. "I wanted to apologize and explain my actions," she began. "No explanation is necessary," I replied. "You made your choices, and now you're facing the consequences." She hesitated before continuing. "When you served me with the divorce papers, Troy promised to marry me once it was over. But now he's been arrested, and I have nowhere to go. I kept this house as a reminder of you, but it's clear you've moved on." Before she could say more, I played her a recording of Troy discussing her future with his associates shortly after she was served. Her expression turned somber as she listened. Suddenly, she stood up and ran to the kitchen. Sensing something was wrong, Lindy and I followed quickly. Chris was overwhelmed with emotion, but we managed to calm her down and assure her that things could get better. Lindy called for help, and we stayed with Chris until professionals arrived. At the hospital, I made sure she was cared for and reached out to her mother to explain the situation. Her mother, deeply concerned, flew in to be with her. We spoke at length, and I assured her I'd help with medical expenses. A few weeks later, Chris's mother called to let me know that Chris was receiving therapy at a treatment center near her home. I was relieved to hear that she was getting the care she needed and thanked her mother for the update. Troy was found guilty of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, human trafficking, administering drugs without consent, and fraud. He received 3 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Carl faced the same fate. Their 3 accomplices were each sentenced to 25 years to life for conspiracy to commit murder. Hector received a 20-year sentence for human trafficking and organized crime. Chris attempted suicide for the 3rd time and was admitted to a mental health clinic. Following a nervous breakdown, she was transferred to a state mental facility. Lindy and I have moved into a 4-bedroom house, and we're expecting our 2nd child in 5 months. Life is finally looking up.